Thank you for joining us. This is heading into our month of August webinars. So we thank you for being here today. We're really excited to present on the behavioral responsiveness for parents. We think this is a great topic and think you guys will get a whole lot out of that. Before we get started, let's do a little bit of introduction as to who we are and what we do, and then we'll do a little bit of housekeeping stuff before we get our speaker going. So my name is Megan Sanders. I'm the Training and Evaluation Specialist for Partners Resource Network, and joining me today is Christina Henning, who is our Director of Statewide Services. And we are the nonprofit agency that operates the statewide network of parent training and information centers in Texas. We are federally funded from a grant by Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, known as OSEP. And we provide education, information, referrals, training and technical assistance, emotional support, ARD meeting assistance for parents of children with disabilities birth to 26 years of age, as well as the professionals working with them. So that is who Partners Resource Network is. And before we get you on that, let's talk a little bit about these boxes down here on your menu. As you see, there's a chat box, and we've been interacting in that. So if you have comments, you have any kind of technical issues or something like that, please feel free to drop those in the chat box. We also have the box that's Q&A. So this is our question and answer box. If you have a question during the presentation for Thad, we will ask you to put that in the Q&A box. It helps us keep things separated so we can handle technical questions and any comments and stuff like that over in our chat box. But when it comes to questions for the presenter and on the presentation itself, let's go ahead and put those in the Q&A box so that they don't get lost. I know a few of you have sent emails with some questions for Thad Greene, and that's great, but if you'll make sure you just plug those in the Q&A, I want to make sure they don't get ignored or go unanswered. So if you'll just make sure you put those in there, and we will be good. All right, so this is Mr. Thad Greene, and he is a licensed specialist in school psychology. He's a professional sensei in the martial arts of Aikido and the father of 2 boys. His approach to all 3 of those roles centers on the need to practice compassion with ourselves as well as those around us, because ultimately we are all in this together. So we're really excited to have him. I know that you will do a great job, Thad, and I will let you get rolling.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone else to Behavioral Responsiveness for Parents. I should mention before we dive into content that this is a really large area, and one 45-minute presentation is not going to be enough. There are several areas even within this presentation which would have really benefited from more details or more examples than we have time for. But we do have that Q&A session at the end, so keep an eye on that. When I present similar content to teachers, I usually have to begin with several slides about why behavior and behavioral responsiveness is worth spending time on at all. I don't think I need to talk about that with parents, however, because the reality is that everyone blames us for everything our children do all the time anyway. Now, there are some parents who have children that never manifest behavioral concerns at all. They are continually compliant and polite. And the parents of those children tend to spend their lives full of anxiety about whether their children are going to have the assertiveness to survive as independent adults, from which we may conclude that even when it's easy, it's not easy. So let's talk about what makes this stuff difficult. To put it succinctly, confusion and upset. We get confused and we get upset, and when we are confused and upset, we become frightened. We are frightened of the child because the child's behavior is the thing that happened right before we got confused and upset. We're frightened of ourselves because we feel out of control and we're not entirely sure what we're going to do. And we're frightened that that loss of control will spread and then the world will end. The irony here is that none of these nasty feelings are caused by our child's behavior. In actual point of fact, we've done it to ourselves. Or rather, our amygdala has done it to us. Your amygdala is a little gland that lurks deep within your brain, and its job is to keep you alive. It does that by carefully monitoring your surroundings all the time. And at the first hint of a threat, it shrieks its little lungs out and runs around in circles, waving its hands in the air. The amygdala is extraordinarily good at its job, and all of the other glands in your body listen to it. So when it detects a threat, that's what triggers the classic fight, flight, freeze reflex. And most of that reflex is useful. We get stronger, we get faster, our senses become more acute, we get more ready to handle whatever physical threat is coming our way. The problem here is that the amygdala doesn't distinguish between physical and non-physical threats, and that in order to get us stronger and faster, it pulls resources away from systems it doesn't think we need to stay alive in a crisis. And one of those systems happens to be our brain. As a result, when we most need to think clearly, we can't think clearly. There are two conclusions to be drawn from this fact. The first is that we need to do as much of our thinking as possible in advance while we still can. And the second is that when I talk about behavioral management, I'm not really talking about our children. The reality is, all of us need to learn behavioral responsiveness. And it doesn't come easily for any of us. This also means that it is always okay to ask for help because people need other people. 3 people that I particularly recommend are Randy Sprick, Ross Greene, and Alfie Kohn. Now, personally, I'm an educator, and like the military, public education floats on a sea of acronyms, which means it's basically impossible for me to get through a presentation without using at least a couple of acronyms myself. And our next slide presents the first, Stoic, S-T-O-I-C. Historically, the Stoics were a group of Greek philosophers who believed that it was really important to stay calm, even in the face of strong emotions. The acronym here is a set of tools designed to help people who work with children stay calm, even in the face of strong emotion. This acronym also provides the outline for the rest of this presentation. We're going to begin with structure, because structure is the foundation of everything else. The structures we as parents develop form the physics of our children's world. If our rules are not reliable, if they don't make sense, if they don't help, then our children have no ground on which to stand. But that doesn't mean that all structures are equal. If we want to create good structures for our children, then we need to spend some time thinking about the purpose of structure. Essentially, the purpose of structure is to establish the win conditions. The structures we build are intended to help our children succeed at the tasks we give them. They are also intended to help us succeed at the tasks of parenting. And we have broad latitude to figure out what structures are going to work for our families. Really, we're only constrained by 2 limits here: the laws of the place in which we live, and the communications from our children about what they need from us. But within those guidelines, there is no one right way. But that doesn't mean there aren't wrong ways. Structuring is what we need from each other in order to do our respective jobs effectively. Which means the first piece of structuring is understanding what our needs actually are. For example, if I notice that I get irritable anytime my children are being too loud in the living room, then I need to recognize that fact and build a rule about volume control in the living room into my household structure. No one else can tell me how loud my living room needs to be. But because no one else can do it, I have to do it. Fortunately, there are some tools available to make that at least a little bit easier. And the next tool is our next acronym. CHAMPS, standing for Conversation, Help, Activity, Movement, and Participation, leading to success. I should mention that both Stoic and CHAMPS are acronyms developed by Dr. Randy Sprick, who's one of those people I referenced earlier on the citation screen. Most of his research is geared towards classroom teachers, but happily, it applies very well to parents also. The idea here is that if I want to be clear about what my rules actually are, I need to think about every activity I do with my children and every activity my children do around me in terms of these 5 criteria. So let's spend a little time with CHAMP. C is for conversation. These rules, the answers to these questions, are going to change from one activity to the next. Think about going to the grocery store, or attending a worship service, or wrestling on the carpet. Now think about how overwhelming it must be for our children who are expected to learn all of the rules for all of the different activities, usually without a great deal of clarity. I recommend taking one piece of paper for each activity and going down line by line to answer these questions. They may seem obvious, but even if your answers are obvious to you, they are probably not so obvious to people that aren't you, like, for example, your children. And at second glance, it may turn out that your answers aren't as clear as you thought they were. If they really are clear, then answering these questions is going to be quite easy and you don't have to spend much time on it. But if it turns out that you do need to spend more time on it, it's probably well worth investing the time in it. Teachers tend to be very aware that every activity carries its lessons. But as parents, we sometimes forget that what our children do best is learn. And our children are learning something from everything they do. Sometimes it's actually not the rules that need to change. Sometimes it's the activity itself. And it's often worth pausing for a moment as a parent to ask, what is this particular activity teaching to my child? You'll notice that this slide is the first in the CHAMP set that starts with a statement rather than a question. The reason for that is that if you have a child who is not moving at all, what you have is an immediate medical emergency. The rest of the time, the question isn't, can my child move? The question is, what kinds of movement are allowable within this particular activity? And again, the answers are going to vary, not only activity to activity, but child to child. In general, however, the younger the child, the more movement you're going to need to build in, because younger children can't stop moving more. On this slide, I'd like to draw your particular attention to the 2 questions in the middle. Many teachers, and many parents as well, tend to presume that children already know how to handle compliments and corrections. But in truth, both of those things are learned skills. And as with most learned skills, they really do need to be taught. Now at this point, I imagine that at least a few of y'all out there in webinar listening land are thinking, Thad, you are crazy. Do you truly expect me to answer all of these questions for every activity that my children are involved in with or around me? And the answer is actually yeah, because you will spend time dealing with behavioral issues. Better to do so in advance when you're calm and quiet and can think, than to have to make time in the moment of crisis when you are already confused and upset and frightened. Especially when you realize that if you are confused and upset and frightened, your children are confused and upset and frightened as well. In fact, probably more so than you, because there are few things more confusing, upsetting, and frightening to a child than the sight of their parent being confused and upset and frightened. And in that situation, none of you are likely to be making good choices. Better to sink the time in advance. Better still to plan in advance and then teach your children. Let's say you're inspired. You go home and you champsify, and you come up with neat and coherent lists for every activity that your children are involved with. And then you have the horrifying realization that nothing involving your children ever stays neat and coherent for long, which raises the question of what you're going to do next. To answer that question, I'd like to draw an analogy to another area of our lives in which nothing ever stays neat and coherent, specifically politics. I don't think any of us would accuse the current American political situation as being neat and coherent, and yet we still mostly manage to get along, and the system mostly works. And it does, primarily because we have all agreed to follow the guidance of a specific written behavior management plan that begins like this. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and several other subordinate clauses that I can never remember, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Our political system is not smooth, and it's not simple, and it is often not even polite. And yet, when the person we voted for doesn't get elected, we accept that and vow to vote again next time. When the person in office loses the election, that person steps down and voluntarily gives up power. This is astonishing, but it happens over and over again because we have all agreed to follow these guidelines, and we have all been trained in how to do that. And so to bring that back down to the household level, I want to talk a little bit about what training looks like. The actual process of teaching is startlingly simple. We prepare, we explain, we model, we review, and then we do it all again. The tricky part is the patience required to keep doing it all again, over and over, because it takes a truly disheartening number of repetitions in order for the lessons to sink in. This is why we do it all the time. I'd like you to imagine yourself as a coach and your children as a team of players who have never played this sport before. You're not going to start on your first day of the season by teaching them elaborate tactics and strategies and ways to advance the ball in subtle and sophisticated fashion. You're not going to do that because that's not what your players are ready for. You're going to start by teaching them how to tie their shoes, what the whistle means, how and when and where to step onto the field, when and how and where to touch the ball. But as they master that first layer of basic skills, then you're going to add in another layer, which is a little bit more complicated than that. And keep doing that over and over again until by the end of the season tournament, your players have mastered a series of skills of increasing complexity. And they've mastered some of the basic ones so well that they don't even need reminders anymore, except, of course, that you're going to periodically remind them anyway, because that's part of what coaches do. In reality, of course, it's more difficult than that. But curiously enough, most of the additional difficulty comes from us. We make the situation worse by thinking things that aren't really helpful. If we're going to be honest, every one of us has had these thoughts. But just because we have all thought them doesn't mean they are true, let alone actually useful. And so I'd like to propose 2 quick tests by which we can find out whether a particular thought is true or useful. The first is the word should. Every one of these statements has the word should somewhere in it, either explicitly as part of the words in the sentence or implicitly behind the stated words. When I say, my children will do it because I said so, I really mean, my children should do it because I said so. And anytime the word should appears, that means there is a conflict between the world as I think it ought to be and the world as it really is. And in such a conflict, the world always wins. It is pointless for me to say, I shouldn't have to repeat myself, if in fact, in this moment, I do need to repeat myself. These aren't helpful thoughts. The other test is empathy. How does it feel when other people think these thoughts about us? Or when they say them out loud? How would you feel if your boss said, my employees should be able to figure out what I want them to do on their own? How would you feel if your mate says, if you haven't gotten it by now, you're never going to get it? Again, these aren't helpful. I'd like to replace these myths with something which is true and helpful. And that something is an equation. And so there's going to be some math on the next slide, so brace yourself for that. But it's useful math because it's an equation derived by Dr. Ross Greene, who's one of the other people I cited on that slide earlier. And it is an equation which can reliably predict when and where a behavioral problem will occur. Think about that. An equation that lets us know in advance when and where a behavior problem is going to happen. And not only that, it's also going to tell us how bad the behavior problem is going to get. That's a pretty powerful tool, and that to me is worth a little math. So here we go. That's it. P equals D minus S. Problem behaviors appear when the demands within a particular setting are larger than the skills available to meet those demands. That also means the only way to bring P down to 0 is to balance the other 2 terms. Which means if you are facing a problem behavior, there are only 2 variables you can affect in order to make that problem behavior go away. Nothing else matters. You either have to reduce the demands, which generally means increasing the structure, or you need to raise the skill, which generally means teaching the expectations. But until D equals S, there's going to be a P. Now, this equation also gives us the tool we need to develop an actual definition for being a bad parent. Now, this next slide may cut a little close to the bone, so be ready for that too. The definition of a bad parent is that there aren't any, because P equals D minus S. When you do something that makes a situation worse, that doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It means that you're in a situation where the demands were higher than your available skills. And that's kind of a relief. But it's a relief with an edge, because if that's the definition of a bad parent, then it is also the definition of a bad child. There aren't any. P equals D minus S. It's worth noting that this is also the definition of a bad teacher, and for that matter, the definition of a bad presenter, because the reality is we are all doing the best we can with what we have, where we are. We all have some skills. We all want to succeed. And every one of us learns by making mistakes. Most parents get a little bit twitchy when I mention this third point. Home is the best place for behavior problems to occur. But what I mean when I say that is that home is the safe place for behavioral problems to occur. Remember, humans learn by making mistakes. So when your child does something wrong, that means they are in the process of learning how to do it right, which means they must have a place where it is safe to do it wrong, or they won't ever get it wrong enough to get it right. Home is that place. But our job as parents is more than just to provide a place where it's safe to be wrong. We also have to explicitly teach how to do the thing right. We do it in 3 ways. We pre-teach, we teach, and we reteach. Pre-teaching is teaching before the skill has to be demonstrated. Teaching is teaching when the skill needs to be demonstrated. And reteaching is teaching after the skill needed to be demonstrated. It starts with pre-teaching because that's how we communicate our expectations, but that won't be enough. Notice, however, that every behavior isn't the same as every behavioral problem. Success needs to be taught too, and we teach success by celebrating it every chance we get, which is a topic we'll return to a little bit later on. However, notice also that celebrating success and correcting mistakes both depend on recognizing the moments. The cardinal rule of parenting is pay attention. And that's important because it accomplishes 3 things. Measures change, it triggers change, and it keeps us honest. Notice, however, that by the end of this slide, we've shifted from observation to data. There are 2 very important differences between those terms. Firstly, observation is singular, but data are plural. Secondly, observation means what we notice, but data means what we write down. If you want data, most especially if you want good data, you need to be writing things down, and you need to be doing that repeatedly, which means we need to talk about what kinds of things need to get writ. There are 2 layers of data that are useful for behavioral things. The first layer is setting data. This is often qualitative, by which I mean it tells the story. Setting data provides the context within which the behavior we're actually interested in occurred. The acronym here is ABCD, and one of these days, I'm going to write an alphabet book. A is for antecedent, the thing that happened before the thing we're interested in. The antecedent is important because humans are purpose-driven animals, and the behavior may well have been triggered by the thing that happened right before. The behavior itself is the thing that we're interested in, and we're going to talk more about that on the next slide. C is for consequence. And here, consequence doesn't mean disciplinary punishment. Consequence simply means the thing that happened next. And the consequence, because humans are purpose-driven animals, and the behavior might have been triggered by the consequence. And then we have denouement, which is a term from literary analysis, basically meaning a resolution. If the consequence is the thing that happened next, the denouement is how the situation ultimately resolved. And if I know the antecedent, the consequence, and the denouement, then I've got a pretty good sense of what was going on around the behavior. But I don't yet know enough about the behavior itself. To describe the behavior itself, I need to reach my second layer of data, which in noted contrast to this layer, must be numeric. The acronym here is FID, which is a lousy acronym, but I haven't been able to come up with a better one. Frequency, intensity, duration. How often, how bad, and how long. And again, the answers to these questions must be numerical. In order to explain why that is, I'd like to tell a quick story that happened to me in a previous career. In this previous career, I was going all over the country doing presentations for school districts. And at one point, I had a presentation in Kentucky in February. And so a couple of days before I was due to show up and present, I called my contact in the local school district to confirm the critical information, that I had my flight, that I had my hotel, that I knew the address of the place I needed to be, things like that. And at the end of the conversation, my contact casually mentioned, oh, by the way, Thad, you should remember, it gets cold in Kentucky in February, so dress warmly. And I, Houston boy that I am, casually replied, no worries, I've got a sweater. And there was a pause on the other end of the line. And then my contact said, Thad, that might not be enough. It gets cold in Kentucky in February. And I said, so I should bring a hat too? And I could practically feel her impression of my competence spiraling downwards, as there was a slightly longer pause, and then she said, Thad, our high today was 14 degrees. And I said, oh, because when she used numbers, I understood what her words meant. Now, people who are not trained in data collection, which includes virtually all teachers, as well as virtually all parents, often find these last two slides slightly intimidating. And so I would like to offer at least 2 tips that will hopefully help at least a little bit. Those 2 tips are, make it math and keep it simple. And I particularly want to emphasize that second one, because it may well be the case that collecting the data really is worse than living with the problem. And it is always within your rights as a parent to say, you know what? We're good, thanks. It's okay. And if you can say that, you can be proud because you just solved the problem by defining it as not a problem anymore. Now it's simply something you're living with. Of course, if it turns out that living with this situation actually is problematic, then at some point in the future, you are also within your rights to go back and say, actually, let's not. Let's go ahead and make it math and figure out what kind of data we need to collect. Because truly, if you're up against a problem that isn't going away on its own, you're going to need some data. Because it's only when you have data that you can trust your judgments and really understand what's going on. In the absence of data, we're really just making a series of blind guesses. And while we may occasionally get lucky, it's very unlikely that we're going to get sustained, directed growth with a series of blind guesses. We're going to need the data. But the data alone won't be enough either. Because no matter how much data we gather, no matter how closely we pay attention, all of our observations are useless unless we have a relationship with the person we are observing. And that applies to ourselves as well. If you want to be a better parent, build a better relationship with yourself. Let's talk about what that looks like. One of the hidden rules in educational presentations is that we are all required to have at least one inspirational quote. Here's mine. We have found that the single factor common to every successful change initiative is that relationships improve. If relationships improve, things get better. If they remain the same or get worse, ground is lost. Thus, leaders must be the consummate relationship builders. I'd like to draw your attention to those 6 words in the middle. If relationships improve, then things get better. Think about how absolutely revelatory that sentence really is. If you do nothing else with your children but improve your relationship with them, things will get better. But if we don't improve our relationships with our children, then it doesn't matter what else we do. Because unless those relationships improve, things won't get better. which means it is terribly important that we understand how to improve relationships. Fortunately, there's actually one very simple key. The way to improve relationships is positive attention. Positive attention breaks down into these two categories: contingent attention and non-contingent attention. Contingent attention is earned praise. Think of it as what you like about the other person. More specifically, what you like about what the other person did. Non-contingent attention is unearned affirmation. And it's not about what the other person does. It's about the fact that they exist at all. Contingent attention is like. Non-contingent attention is love. And if contingent attention is about justice, earned praise for observed actions, then non-contingent attention is about grace. They are both hugely important. They are both very different, but they both share one very important commonality as well. And that is, they are not what you think, because it's not about us. We're going to talk more about both of these, but I'd like to start with the second one, non-contingent attention. If structure forms the physics of your children's world, non-contingent attention, this affirmation stuff, forms the climate, the atmosphere in which you and your children move together. We can't stop breathing for long. Atmosphere is really important. But creating atmosphere is surprisingly simple. All we need to do is cultivate the climate of our home. But just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. Climate is made of 1,000 little things, day after day after day. It's not like the weather, which swings around on an hourly basis. Climate is the general trend, the long arc of continuity. And our task as parents is to keep doing the little things day after day after day in order to bend that arc in a good direction. You will fail at this. You'll fail at it a lot because you're human, and failure is what humans do. That's okay. Try again tomorrow. Try again every tomorrow. After every drought, bring back the rain. And meanwhile, look for things you can praise. Now, if affirmation was simple but not easy, then praise is surprisingly complex, and it's not easy either, because it's very easy to do praise wrong. Praise needs to be specific. Saying good job is lousy praise because job doesn't really have a specific meaning. You need to tell your child exactly what they did that they did well. You also need to focus on action rather than quality. For example, don't tell your child you're very intelligent, because your child has no control over their own intelligence. Instead, praise effort, praise creativity, praise stick-to-itiveness, because your child chose to do those things. And most especially be careful that you don't praise something your child takes for granted, because then praise can easily come across as condescension, and that does more harm than good. To be safe, praise things that are new, things that are difficult, and most especially things of which your child is proud. So, here's a list of some specific things which you could legitimately praise your child for. But wait, I hear you cry. Thad, if this list is correct, then there's always something happening for which I could be praising my child. And the answer is yes. That is exactly correct. Every one of our children at every moment of the day is doing something which is worth praising. Our job as parents is to find that thing and call it out, even if the child is in the midst of doing something wrong. Because no matter how bad the situation is, it could be worse. Find the thing your child hasn't screwed up yet and praise that. You might find yourself saying, hey, you're really, but you've kept your hands to yourself. That's cool. Or you might find yourself saying, hey, you're really angry with me, and you even hit me once. But then you remembered that we have a rule about keeping hands to self in this house, and you stopped. That's awesome. Or you might even find yourself saying, hey, a little while back, you were hitting me a lot. But now it looks like you've calmed down. I'm really glad. There's always something happening that's worth praising. And praise can be exploding through your home like popcorn in a popper. That's actually really important because it teaches a very important lesson. Specifically, people tend to become what we show them they are. I heard a story once about a woman with a kindergarten-aged daughter who extensively redecorated the living room involving paint. And this was not the water-soluble finger paint variety. And the mother comes into the living room and sees the carnage which has been wrought and loudly exclaims, "You are such a mess." And the child looks at her mom and says, "Oh no, me. I made a mess." Now it's possible that I could tell this story and focus on what the mom said. And then maybe this is a story about a mother losing control in a moment of stress and speaking disrespectfully to her child. Or maybe I could tell this story and focus on what the girl said. And then this might be a story about a child speaking disrespectfully to her mom. But instead, I want to focus on how well that mother had prepared her daughter for this moment. Because even as young as she was, she still understood that what she did not change her value as a person. That's important. It's also difficult because our brain really isn't designed to notice success. Noticing success is a learned skill. And just like so many other learned skills, it has to be taught. And most of us are pretty bad at it. Maybe because our parents never learned either. That's okay. We can learn. And our children can watch us learning. Because when our children witness us learning, they learn to believe that they can learn too. And of course, this raises another question. If it's all about happiness and fun and positive relationships, then why do we need to correct it all? What's the point of rules? And the answer is the difference between a sport and a brawl. Rules make the game interesting because chaos isn't fun. The rules we design, the structures we create, establish the win conditions for the activities we do with our children. They enable our children to win by defining what winning means in the particular activities, which is why it is so important that we consider our rules and our definitions in advance, which means we can't correct fluently until we've started with ourselves and done the structuring thing. Remembering the Stoic model, remembering the equation P equals D minus S, and deciding in advance how we're going to handle it when things stop being neat and coherent. I personally recommend we take a lesson from gravity. A child learns to walk by falling over a lot. And gravity never bends the rules. When you lean too far, You will fall. Every time, no exceptions. At the same time, gravity never makes a big deal out of it. It doesn't get impatient. It doesn't get angry. It doesn't shout. It just applies the same simple consequence every time. And that consequence really is simple. You lean, you fall. And it's fast. And it's always followed by another chance to try again. Every time. Gravity never carries a grudge. It never stops teaching. And because it never stops, we eventually learn. We learn how far we can lean before we fall. And that's how we learn how to balance. And ultimately, how we learn how to move. Gravity is also boring. It doesn't really make a fuss. And that's important too, because most children are attracted to fuss. If your child's need for intensity is greater than her need for approval, you need to be most intense when things are going well. That doesn't necessarily mean loud. Some children don't like loud, and that's okay too. But it does mean focused and enthusiastic. And always remember that last point. We correct when it's necessary. Praise constantly. I asked this question much earlier in the presentation as well, and I'd like to come back to it again. As parents, we are always tempted to believe we have more authority than we really do. Ultimately, you can't make your children do anything. Your children are free. But by the same token, they can't make you do anything either. All you can ever do is your best, and you have authority over you. You will mess up. You will make mistakes over and over again because you're human too, and that's all right. In fact, that's good. Let your children witness you fail, because then they have the opportunity to witness how an adult recovers from failure. Let your children watch you fall so that they can see you rise and try again. If you want your children to learn how to apologize, get in the habit of apologizing to them when you do things wrong. And why not? The truth of the matter is, you deserve as many chances as they do. You are no less worthy than any of your children. This is the lesson. If you teach your children this, that they belong, that they are competent, that they are valuable, then you have done your job as a parent. And every day, every moment is another opportunity to teach this lesson. And if this lesson really is true, then this entire presentation can be summarized in 2 sentences. The behavior you reward, the behavior you focus upon, is the behavior you get. And the behavior you are actually using is the behavior you are actually teaching. If you take nothing else from this presentation with you today, please remember this final thought. You are not alone. Thank you.
Megan, do you need me to unmute you? Yeah. All right. Well, we are back. I think that you basically gave them so much information that it may take them a minute to come up with questions for you. If you have questions for Thad, go ahead and enter those in the Q&A box.
And that's the advantage of the webinar format too, because this gets saved, right?
Yes.
And everything can be reviewed at later times.
Yeah.
It's a lot of good information. We're getting some responses in chat saying excellent information, great presentation.
Well,
thank you very much, Thad.
That makes the presenter happy. Thank you.
Yeah, everyone seems to really like it. We do have one question that just came in. What kind of situations do I prepare my child for?
Everything, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a simple answer to that because parenting isn't a simple thing. Ultimately, what we are preparing our children for is our own death. The ultimate goal of parenting is for the child not to need us anymore. And that is terrifying and massive. But to bring it back down a bit more to earth, that's when you lean on the equation. E equals D minus S. Your children need the skills to meet the demands of their lives. As long as there's no behavioral problems manifesting, then D equals S. You're okay. You can spend your time predicting the next demands and teaching the skills that you think they're going to need next. But as soon as a problem behavior occurs, you know that, this is a situation where my child doesn't have the skills to meet this particular demand. And that lets you start narrowing in, okay, so what are the skills that this demand really requires? If my child is having an issue with screaming in the grocery store, what is it about being in the grocery store that my child can't cope with? And what skills do I need to teach in order to help my child cope more effectively? So I guess the answer is that your kids will tell you what skills they need by freaking out.
Yeah. All right. So next question comes from Allison. What about children that are not reinforced by the positive attention, that actually recoil from it or are little contrarians?
That is where it's important to remember the two varieties of positive attention, because there are children who do not like praise for whatever reason. And so there's a couple of options you can take, depending on the age and developmental level of the child, and also depending on your relationship with the child. If it's possible, there's no harm in saying to your kid, hey, I'd really like to be able to let you know when you've done something that I think is cool. How can I tell you that in a way that you'll like? And let them tell you how they want that information to come to them. If you can't do that, then lean into the non-contingent stuff. Hey, I just really like you being part of my family. And I just thought I'd say that. You're cool, kid. And move on. But lots. Sometimes all it takes is to look at the child and nod. And maybe that's all they want. But again, your children will tell you the kind of positive feedback they want by flipping out if it's the wrong sort.
All right. We had a question come over from the chat box. What types of consequences do you suggest for a child that gets angry and yelling when they are mad?
Okay, so the first thing to realize is that the anger and the yelling isn't the problem. The anger and the yelling is your child's communication to you that there's a problem. That's the P. But really, you need to be focusing on the D and the S. So a punitive consequence in and of itself isn't likely to help because it doesn't teach the skills and it doesn't reduce the demands. Now, it's possible that some kind of a timeout might be useful, but that's not a punishment for the child. That's a chance for the child to calm down and regain self-control. In order to fix the actual issue, you're going to need to work the equation. And the equation's never about the yelling. The equation's about the D and the S that triggered the yelling. That having been said, go back to gravity. Consequences need to be very consistent, which means they need to be very brief. For example, think about speed limits. I live in Texas. I imagine there are probably 20 people in the state who actually follow the speed limit on a regular basis. All of us tend to assume that the speed limit is optional because the consequence is so inconsistent. Most of the time, there's no officer. And when there is an officer, they're usually busy with someone else. And when they do use, okay, it's intense, but it's not often. Now imagine a situation if your car had a little device in it that was attached to your bank account, and every time you drove more than 5 miles above the posted speed limit, it deducted 3 cents from your account for every mile. None of us would ever speed again. But it's not the severity of the consequence that makes the difference. It's the reliability of it. And so you as a parent need to make your consequences small enough that you really will follow through and do them every time. But then you have to remember that that in itself won't be enough, because that by itself isn't teaching skills.
All right. Next question. How do you get the child's buy-in to allow a parent to teach new skills?
So I'm going to reframe that question a little bit. Children are learning all the time. You can't stop a child from learning. All you can do is present the lesson you want them to learn over and over again as clearly as possible. I have a friend who's a veterinarian who told me once that my cat knows me better than I know my cat. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, look at it this way. Your cat is entirely dependent on you for food and shelter and safety. That cat pays attention to you all the time. You might not notice it, but that cat hears your car coming from half a block away. That cat knows exactly what your mood is at any given moment. And I thought, okay, she's got me. And then it hit me that this exactly applies to our children. They depend on us. And so whether they show it or not, they're paying attention. But they're not paying attention to what we say. They're paying attention to how we act, what we do, and the emotional force we put out into the world. But make no mistake about it, they're listening.
All right, we're going to take one more question, and then we've got to let Thad get back to work. But this question came in, so we want to make sure we get it answered. Anytime we loosen the demands to improve relationships, the kids take advantage. Then comes the list of, if you do this, I have to take this away. I really want to avoid these situations. How?
Right. It is always better to start with more structure than you need and reduce demands in the evidence of success, rather than to start with not enough and have to add in more. You don't build relationships by reducing the demands. You build the relationships with positive attention, and that happens within the structure. Children need structure. They need to know that the physics of the world are reliable and consistent, that what you say is going to happen really is going to happen. They'll protest that because of course they will. That's limit testing. That doesn't mean they actually want no limits. They want to be sure the limit is real. By all means, establish the structure you need in order for your children to succeed, and then celebrate that success. Does that help? I hope.
I hope so. I'm sure she'll come back and let us know. All right. Well, we know that you are a busy, busy man and that you have to get back to work. If your question was not addressed today, then please feel free to send those on to myself or Christina, and we'll pass those to Thad, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them through like an email form. Are you good with that, Thad? Perfect. Well, thank you so, so much for joining us today. Everybody's feedback in the chat box has been really great. We really appreciate you joining us and coming on and helping parents. That's what we're here for. So All right, a few things before we let you guys go. We want to remind you that we have 2 additional webinars coming up in the month of August. So next Tuesday, which is August 13th, same time, 12:15 p.m. Central Time, we have Start Smart, Strategies for Conquering Back-to-School Anxiety. And that is with Dr. Wes Dodson, who is the director of Burkhart Center for Autism Education and Research at Texas Tech. And then on Tuesday, August 27th, we have Dr. Charles Hallmark from Grace Psychology Services, who's going to present on anxiety disorders in children. So we hope you'll join us for both of these that are coming up for this month. We feel like they are great topics, and we are ready to tackle a new school year. So make plans to join us for that. We have any additional slides, Christina?
Yeah, can you not see? It's the Facebook Live series is on right now.
Oh, there we go. All right, upcoming Facebook Live series we have is Gearing Up for the New School Year. So starting on August 22nd and running for the 4 weeks, we're going to talk about different pieces of the new school year and things that you want to work on or get put in place. So we're going to talk about IEP implementing and how that works and making sure that the IEP is getting followed from the very beginning. And we're going to talk about who do you call whenever an issue arises, amending your IEP, and if you get back to school and your IEP is not working, what do we do? So we're going to address all 4 of those coming up at the end of August, August 22nd through September 12th. All right, so this is our information. If you have anything that you would like to send myself or Christina, our email addresses are on the slide, as well as our statewide webinars link, and then our Facebook page. We post a lot of really cool things on Facebook, so please feel free to hop on and follow us there. Copies of today's presentation, as well as our other presentations that have been done, are on our website, so you can access those as well as all of the handouts. If you have any comments or questions regarding a webinar, please shoot me an email or send one over to Christina. We love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you next Tuesday, August 13th. Bye, guys.